In just moments, a routine daytime interview turns into an exchange no one in the studio was prepared for. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It started as one of those segments that felt familiar to anyone who watches daytime television regularly. The hosts were seated around the table. The audience had just settled after the commercial break, and the introduction was warm and respectful. Paul Giamatti had joined the panel to promote his latest project and to talk more broadly about the themes in his work: character-driven stories, flawed protagonists, and the social issues that sometimes frame those narratives. The tone at first was relaxed. There was light laughter, a few jokes about his reputation for playing intense, complex characters, and a brief exchange about how he prepares for emotionally demanding roles. Sunny Hostin, known for approaching conversations from a legal and social justice perspective, steered the discussion toward a topic that connected loosely to the themes of Giamatti's latest film. The film explored institutional accountability and moral compromise, and Sunny asked him whether he believed Hollywood sometimes oversimplifies those conversations. It was not an aggressive question. It was framed as thoughtful, almost academic. But the shift in tone was noticeable. The room grew slightly quieter as the conversation moved away from promotion and into something more substantive. Giamatti leaned forward in his chair before answering. He paused, which in live television always feels longer than it probably is. He acknowledged that films do simplify complex systems, saying that storytelling often requires narrowing focus. But he also added that he sometimes worries about audiences expecting art to function as policy analysis. His voice was calm, measured, and deliberate. There was no visible irritation at that point. If anything, he seemed reflective. Sunny responded by saying that, as someone who once worked as a prosecutor, she believes representation in media shapes public understanding more than artists sometimes admit. She pressed gently, asking whether actors and filmmakers have a responsibility to ensure nuance when dealing with topics like justice, inequality, or institutional power. Her tone remained professional, but she did interrupt briefly as Giamatti began to elaborate, clarifying that she wasn't accusing him personally, just raising a broader question. This is where the shift began to feel more noticeable. Giamatti nodded, but his expression changed subtly. He straightened in his seat and folded his hands together. He said he respects the concern, but he pushed back on the idea of responsibility being placed primarily on storytellers. He explained that art reflects society rather than instructing it, and that expecting films to correct systemic misunderstandings might place too much weight on creative work. The audience reacted with a soft murmur. Nothing dramatic, but the kind of quiet ripple that indicates engagement. Some people clapped lightly when Sunny referenced the real-world consequences of media narratives. Others nodded when Giamatti emphasized artistic freedom. It wasn't a divided room, but it was attentive. Sunny followed up by saying that when certain narratives are repeated, especially about marginalized communities, they can reinforce harmful stereotypes. She mentioned studies about public perception and criminal justice reform, speaking from her background as both an attorney and a journalist. Her tone became firmer, not confrontational, but clearly passionate. She asked him directly whether he feels comfortable portraying morally compromised characters in systems that harm real people. Giamatti took a breath before answering. He clarified that portraying a flawed character does not equate to endorsing their actions. He said he often chooses roles precisely because they expose uncomfortable truths. His voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable seriousness in it now. He spoke more slowly, choosing words carefully. He emphasized that discomfort can lead to meaningful reflection, and that sanitizing stories might actually weaken their impact. One of the other co-hosts briefly interjected, attempting to lighten the moment by noting that audiences are capable of separating fiction from endorsement. There was a small laugh from the crowd, easing the tension slightly. But Sunny returned to her central point, saying that not all viewers engage critically, and that responsibility doesn't disappear simply because a story is labeled fiction. At this stage, the disagreement was clear, but it was controlled. There was no raised voice, no personal attack. What made it serious was the tone. Giamatti leaned forward again and responded directly to Sunny rather than addressing the group broadly. He said he understands the concern, but he feels uneasy when creative professionals are told to carry moral accountability for societal interpretation. He added that he trusts audiences more than that. The body language around the table shifted. The other host sat back slightly, listening closely. Sunny maintained eye contact and nodded while he spoke, but she interjected to clarify that she wasn't calling for censorship. She said she was advocating for awareness. That distinction became a focal point. Giamatti agreed that awareness is important, but reiterated that art's primary obligation is honesty, not instruction. The studio audience was quiet during this exchange, which is often a sign that viewers are genuinely processing what they're hearing. There were no boos or overt reactions, just focused attention. The conversation had moved beyond a promotional interview and into something closer to a panel discussion. What stood out most was the pacing. Neither party rushed. Sunny asked follow-up questions that were pointed but not accusatory. Giamatti responded thoughtfully, sometimes pausing before continuing. The seriousness came not from volume, but from intention. Both were clearly invested in the topic. As the segment progressed, the host sitting at the center of the table attempted to summarize the exchange, suggesting that perhaps the core difference was about where responsibility begins and ends. That reframing slightly softened the edges of the disagreement. Sunny agreed that nuance is necessary, while Giamatti nodded and said nuance is often lost in broader debates. The conversation didn't spiral. It didn't become personal, but it did become intense in a subtle way. The expressions were focused, the gestures smaller and more deliberate. It was the kind of moment that reminds viewers that live television can still host real, unscripted discussion. By the end of this first portion of the segment, it was clear that what started as a standard promotional appearance had turned into a serious exchange about art, responsibility, and public perception. And as the commercial break approached, the atmosphere in the studio felt more thoughtful than before, less lighthearted, more reflective. The producers cut to break at a natural pause, but the expressions on both Sunny Hostin's and Paul Giamatti's faces suggested the conversation was far from over. When the show returned from commercial break, the energy in the studio felt noticeably different. It wasn't tense in a dramatic sense, but it was focused. The kind of focus that comes when everyone at the table understands the conversation has moved beyond a promotional interview and into something more layered. The applause as the hosts came back on camera was polite but slightly restrained, as if the audience sensed they were stepping back into a serious discussion rather than a light segment. The moderator briefly recapped where things had left off, summarizing that the conversation centered on artistic responsibility and how media portrayals influence public perception. Paul Giamatti sat upright, hands loosely clasped, listening carefully. Sunny Hostin glanced down at her notes for a moment before looking back at him, ready to continue. Sunny clarified her position first. She said she wanted to make sure viewers understood that she values art deeply and respects actors who take on challenging roles. But she explained that as someone who has worked within the justice system, she has seen firsthand how narratives can shape public policy and voter attitudes. She pointed out that when certain depictions are repeated across film and television, they don't exist in isolation, they accumulate. Giamatti nodded while she spoke, but his expression remained serious. When she finished, he responded in a steady tone. He acknowledged that repetition in storytelling can influence perception. However, he said he believes the responsibility for interpreting stories ultimately lies with audiences and with broader institutions like education and journalism. He explained that he worries about expecting actors to function as moral gatekeepers. Sunny gently interrupted at that point, clarifying that she wasn't suggesting actors should screen stories for moral perfection. Instead, she asked whether there's a moment in the process, when choosing a role, when developing a character, where an actor considers the broader social implications. It was a precise question, delivered calmly but firmly. Giamatti took a longer pause this time. He leaned back slightly and folded one arm across his torso, resting the other hand near his chin. He said that of course he thinks about implications. He explained that when he approaches a character, especially one embedded in a controversial system, he tries to understand that character's humanity rather than simplify them into a symbol. He added that portraying complexity can be a form of responsibility in itself. The audience responded with light applause at that comment, though it wasn't overwhelming. It felt more like acknowledgement than agreement. Sunny allowed the applause to fade before responding. She said complexity is important, but she questioned whether audiences always walk away seeing that nuance. She noted that many viewers consume content quickly and may not engage in the deeper analysis that actors and filmmakers assume. One of the co-hosts stepped in briefly, suggesting that perhaps this is where media literacy becomes essential. That comment created a moment of common ground. Giamatti agreed immediately that media literacy plays a huge role. He said he would much rather see investment in education and critical thinking than in limiting artistic expression. Sunny agreed about education, but returned to her central concern. She pointed out that the industry itself has evolved in response to criticism before, whether regarding representation, casting, or storytelling perspectives. She asked whether acknowledging social impact is simply part of that evolution. At this point, Giamatti's tone became more direct. Still calm, still measured, but firmer. He said evolution in representation is positive and necessary. However, he distinguished that from what he described as anticipatory self-censorship. He explained that if artists begin second-guessing every potential interpretation, storytelling could become constrained in a way that limits authenticity. The phrase anticipatory self-censorship seemed to land heavily. There was a brief silence around the table. Sunny leaned slightly forward, resting her forearms on the desk. She responded that she doesn't advocate censorship, but she believes awareness does not equal restriction. She said it can mean collaboration, consulting experts, broadening perspectives in writers' rooms, and ensuring context accompanies difficult portrayals. Giamatti listened without interrupting. When he replied, his voice softened slightly. He said he supports collaboration and research wholeheartedly. But he returned to the idea that art's power often comes from ambiguity. He suggested that sometimes discomfort without clear instruction can provoke stronger reflection. The studio audience remained quiet, absorbing the exchange. There were no audible gasps or sharp reactions, just attentive stillness. It was clear that viewers were watching two intelligent adults navigate a complicated topic in real time. As the discussion deepened, Sunny shared a brief anecdote from her legal career about how public perception influenced jury pools in high-profile cases. She connected that to media portrayals of crime and defendants, emphasizing that narratives do not exist in a vacuum. Her voice carried a note of personal conviction, though she remained composed. Giamatti responded by acknowledging that real-world consequences matter. He said he does not dismiss those experiences, but he drew a line between storytelling and systemic reform. He expressed concern about conflating the two, saying that structural change requires policy work and civic engagement more than it requires narrative correction. The moderator attempted to bridge the positions again, suggesting that perhaps both could be true, that art influences culture and culture influences policy, but the responsibility is shared across many sectors. Both Sunny and Giamatti nodded at that. However, Sunny added one more point. She asked whether actors sometimes underestimate their platform. She noted that interviews, press tours, and public statements can contextualize a role in ways that clarify intention. She asked him directly whether he feels that responsibility when speaking publicly. That question shifted the focus slightly from abstract debate to personal practice. Giamatti answered carefully. He said he does feel responsible for explaining his work honestly. He acknowledged that interviews like this one are part of that process. But he reiterated that explanation should not be confused with apology. There was a subtle reaction in the audience at that distinction. A few murmurs, followed by scattered applause. Sunny nodded but asked him to clarify what he meant by apology. He explained that sometimes public discourse pressures artists to preemptively defend their choices, as if assuming wrongdoing. He said he prefers conversation over defense. Sunny responded that conversation is exactly what she is advocating. Her tone softened at that moment, and there was a hint of a smile. The tension eased slightly. The exchange had remained serious, but it never crossed into hostility. One of the co-hosts injected a lighter observation, noting that this might be one of the most philosophical interviews they've had in a while. The audience laughed gently, breaking the intensity for a moment. Giamatti smiled as well, acknowledging that he tends to gravitate toward dense topics. As the segment moved toward its midpoint, the disagreement no longer felt like opposition. Instead, it felt like a careful negotiation of language. Responsibility versus awareness. Freedom versus impact. Interpretation versus intention. Sunny concluded this portion by saying she appreciates his willingness to engage deeply rather than deflect. Giamatti responded that he respects the seriousness of her questions. Their eye contact held for a moment, signaling mutual acknowledgement. The conversation had not been resolved. No one declared a definitive answer. But it had evolved. What began as a subtle pushback had transformed into a layered discussion about art's place in society. And as the camera slowly widened to capture the full table before the next transition, it was clear that viewers at home were witnessing something that felt authentic. Not dramatic, not explosive, but thoughtful and real. The kind of exchange that daytime television occasionally produces when guests and hosts are willing to stay in the complexity instead of retreating to safer ground. As the conversation continued, the moderator subtly shifted the focus, attempting to ground the discussion in something more specific to Paul Giamatti's recent work rather than keeping it entirely theoretical. She referenced one of the central characters in his latest film and pointed out that the character operates within a flawed institution, often making ethically questionable decisions while still being portrayed with emotional depth. That pivot brought the exchange back to something concrete, something viewers could attach to. Giamatti seemed more comfortable when speaking about character process rather than broader cultural expectations. He explained how he approaches roles that exist inside morally complex systems. He said he tries to avoid judgment while portraying them, because if he judges the character, the performance becomes one-dimensional. He spoke calmly, describing how empathy for a character does not equal endorsement of their actions. His tone was steady, but still serious. Sunny Hostin listened closely, then responded by asking whether empathy can sometimes unintentionally humanize harmful behavior in a way that blurs moral accountability. She framed the question carefully, acknowledging that storytelling thrives on complexity, but she pressed on whether certain portrayals risk normalizing dysfunction. The shift at that moment was subtle but important. Giamatti's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. He leaned forward again, resting his forearms lightly on the table. He answered that he believes audiences are capable of holding two truths at once, understanding why someone behaves the way they do, and still recognizing that behavior is wrong. Sunny interjected gently, saying that she hopes that's true, but her experience in the legal system suggests that public sympathy can influence standards of accountability. She was not speaking about his character directly anymore. She was speaking about patterns. The studio audience remained quiet, and the camera briefly captured a few audience members nodding as she spoke. There was no visible division, but there was engagement. It felt like the room understood the gravity of the topic. One of the co-hosts stepped in with a question aimed at broadening the lens. She asked whether the entertainment industry has already begun adjusting to these concerns through the inclusion of consultants, sensitivity readers, and expanded perspectives behind the scenes. That question allowed Giamatti to respond in a less defensive way. He agreed that the industry has changed. He mentioned that many productions now actively seek diverse viewpoints during development. He said he sees that as a positive evolution, not a limitation. But he reiterated that once a story reaches the screen, it must stand on its own. He emphasized that art cannot anticipate every possible interpretation. Sunny nodded, but she returned to her earlier point about patterns. She clarified that her concern is not with a single performance or even a single film, but with recurring narratives that collectively influence how communities are perceived. Her tone was firm but not confrontational. She spoke as someone drawing from lived professional experience, rather than theoretical argument. Giamatti responded more directly this time. He said he agrees that recurring stereotypes are harmful. He stated plainly that he does not support storytelling that reduces entire groups to caricatures. But he made a distinction between stereotype and complexity. He explained that the characters he chooses often expose institutional problems, rather than glorify them. The moderator sensed that the conversation was tightening again and attempted to reframe. She suggested that perhaps what Sunny was raising is about systemic storytelling trends, not individual artistic intention. That clarification created a brief moment of common ground. Sunny agreed with that framing, but added that individuals still participate in systems. She said that even if no single actor is responsible for a pattern, everyone contributes to the broader media landscape. Her voice was calm, but there was weight behind her words. Giamatti paused again before answering. The pause felt deliberate, not evasive. He acknowledged that participation in an industry comes with awareness. He said he does think about the broader landscape when selecting roles. But he resisted the idea that actors should avoid morally challenging characters simply because those characters exist within controversial contexts. The audience offered light applause at that statement. It wasn't loud, but it was supportive. Sunny didn't react to the applause. Instead, she asked him a personal question. Has he ever turned down a role because he felt the narrative framing was irresponsible? That question introduced a more intimate tone. Giamatti smiled slightly, not amused but reflective. He admitted that there have been projects he declined because he didn't connect with the script's perspective. He said sometimes the issue isn't morality, but depth. If a story lacks nuance, he loses interest. Sunny acknowledged that answer, but she followed up by asking whether depth alone is enough when the subject matter intersects with real social harm. Her voice remained even. She was not challenging his integrity, she was pressing on the principle. The exchange at this point felt more intense than earlier, but still controlled. There were no raised voices. Instead, there was careful articulation. Giamatti responded by saying that depth is often the pathway to understanding harm rather than obscuring it. He suggested that portraying systems honestly, even when uncomfortable, can illuminate their flaws more effectively than sanitized narratives. One of the other hosts offered a brief comment about audience responsibility. She pointed out that viewers bring their own biases to what they watch. That observation diffused the focus away from the two of them momentarily. Sunny agreed, but maintained that creators still influence which stories dominate cultural conversation. She referenced how certain genres historically prioritized particular perspectives. She did not accuse Giamatti of perpetuating that, but the implication lingered in the broader discussion. Giamatti's tone softened slightly at that moment. He said he values these conversations because they challenge artists to think critically about their choices. He emphasized that he does not view questions like Sunny's as attacks. Instead, he sees them as part of an ongoing dialogue between creators and audiences. That acknowledgement shifted the atmosphere again. Sunny nodded, and there was a brief shared smile. The seriousness remained, but the sharp edge had dulled. The moderator then asked both of them whether conversations like this are easier or harder in today's media climate, where clips circulate quickly and nuance can be lost. That question resonated with the audience. A few people murmured in agreement. Giamatti responded first. He said he believes long-form discussions are increasingly important because they allow for complexity. He expressed concern about sound bites being pulled out of context. His voice carried a slight note of caution. Sunny agreed about the risk of clipped conversations, noting that context matters deeply in legal and media spaces alike. She said that perhaps part of the solution is more conversations like this one, where disagreement remains respectful and sustained. The audience applauded that sentiment more strongly than earlier remarks. It was the most unified reaction so far. As this portion of the segment continued, it became clear that the disagreement had matured into something closer to a philosophical exchange. The initial pushback had evolved into layered clarification. Neither side had retreated, but neither had escalated. By the time the moderator glanced at the clock and signaled that they had limited time before another break, the tone around the table felt steadier. The seriousness was still present, but it was balanced by mutual recognition. What viewers were witnessing was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense, but a careful negotiation of responsibility, art, and public perception unfolding live on daytime television. And as the show prepared to transition again, it was clear that the conversation had moved beyond a simple question-and-answer format. It had become a moment of genuine engagement, measured, thoughtful, and very real. When the program returned once more from commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio felt calmer, but more deliberate, as though everyone understood that the final stretch of the conversation needed to bring clarity rather than prolong tension. The moderator thanked Paul Giamatti for staying with the topic and acknowledged that the discussion had gone deeper than a typical promotional appearance. There was a brief, appreciative round of applause from the audience, not loud but warm. Sunny Hostin adjusted slightly in her chair and spoke first this time. Her tone was noticeably measured, almost reflective. She said she wanted to make something clear for viewers at home, that her questions were never about limiting creative expression, but about examining influence. She explained that conversations like this matter because daytime television reaches a broad audience, many of whom may not engage in industry-specific debates elsewhere. Giamatti listened without interruption. His posture was relaxed now compared to earlier moments. His hands rested openly on the table rather than clasped together. When Sunny finished, he nodded and thanked her for clarifying. He said he appreciated the distinction between restriction and reflection. However, the seriousness did not disappear entirely. Sunny added that part of her concern comes from seeing how quickly narratives harden into assumptions. She mentioned that when certain portrayals are repeated over decades, they can subtly frame how institutions or communities are viewed. Her voice remained calm, but there was conviction in it. Giamatti responded thoughtfully. He said he agrees that repetition can shape perception. He acknowledged that artists are not operating in isolation from culture. But he reiterated that responsibility is shared among creators, media platforms, educators, critics, and audiences. He emphasized that he resists framing the issue as something artists alone must solve. At that point, one of the co-hosts asked a practical question. How does an actor personally navigate that awareness without becoming paralyzed by it? The question shifted the tone away from disagreement and toward introspection. Giamatti explained that for him, the key is intent and process. He described how he reads scripts carefully, asks questions about framing, and engages in discussions with directors about perspective. He said he believes transparency during production is crucial. His tone was steady, and for the first time in several minutes, there was a hint of ease in his expression. Sunny acknowledged that answer and said that perhaps transparency is one of the most important elements in bridging art and accountability. She noted that when actors openly discuss the complexities of their roles, it gives audiences more context. That comment seemed to create genuine common ground. The audience responded with a gentle wave of applause. It was not reactive, but affirming. The tension that had been present earlier felt less pronounced. Still, the conversation took one final serious turn when Sunny asked whether he ever worries about how his performances might be interpreted by viewers who approach stories from personal trauma or lived experience. The question was not accusatory. It was careful, almost empathetic. Giamatti paused again, this time longer than before. He acknowledged that he does think about that. He said that portraying pain or moral failure carries weight. He explained that he hopes viewers understand that his goal is to explore human frailty rather than excuse it. His voice softened noticeably during this response. Sunny nodded and thanked him for that honesty. She shared briefly that many viewers write to the show about how media affects them personally. She said those messages stay with her and shape the way she frames questions. The exchange at this point felt less like pushback and more like mutual explanation. The seriousness remained, but it was no longer pointed. It had evolved into something reflective. The moderator stepped in to highlight that what viewers were witnessing was a live example of respectful disagreement. She remarked that it's possible to hold different views on responsibility and still engage constructively. The audience responded with stronger applause than at any earlier moment in the segment. Giamatti smiled slightly and said he values spaces where nuance is allowed. He added that he doesn't expect everyone to agree with his perspective, but he appreciates being challenged thoughtfully. His tone carried sincerity. Sunny responded in kind, saying that thoughtful challenge is part of meaningful dialogue. She emphasized that her goal is always to explore, not to accuse. The two exchanged a brief look that conveyed acknowledgement rather than opposition. As the conversation approached its final minutes, the moderator invited each of them to offer a closing thought on the broader issue. Sunny spoke first. She said that storytelling is powerful, and with power comes influence. She stressed that awareness of that influence strengthens art rather than weakens it. Giamatti followed by saying that art's strength also lies in its freedom to confront uncomfortable realities. He reiterated that he believes audiences are capable of engaging with complexity when given the opportunity. He concluded by saying that conversations like this one are part of the cultural process. The tone in the studio felt balanced. There was no sense of unresolved hostility. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement that both perspectives held validity within their own frameworks. As the moderator thanked him for joining the panel and pivoted briefly back to his upcoming project, the audience applauded again, this time more enthusiastically. The applause did not feel like relief. It felt like appreciation for the depth of the exchange. The camera briefly cut to a wide shot of the table. The hosts were composed. Giamatti appeared calm, even thoughtful. Sunny's expression was steady, reflective rather than intense. In those final moments before the next transition, it was clear that what had unfolded was not a dramatic confrontation, but a serious, layered conversation that required patience and focus. It demonstrated how live daytime television can shift from light promotion to substantive dialogue without losing professionalism. And as the segment moved toward its conclusion, viewers could sense that the most intense moments had already passed. Not because anyone backed down, but because the discussion had reached a natural point of understanding. As the segment entered its final stretch, the moderator gently guided the conversation back to Paul Giamatti's current project, giving him space to mention its release date and where audiences could watch it. The shift in tone was noticeable, but not abrupt. It felt like a natural closing arc after a serious exchange. Giamatti spoke briefly about the film's themes again, this time in a more promotional rhythm, though the earlier discussion clearly lingered in the room. Sunny Hostin nodded as he spoke, and when he finished, she added one final remark. She said she appreciates when guests are willing to stay in difficult conversations instead of deflecting to safer territory. Her tone was warm, not pointed. It felt like acknowledgement rather than critique. Giamatti responded by saying that he believes audiences deserve real conversations, even in daytime settings. He thanked the panel for engaging thoughtfully. His demeanor was calm and grounded. There was no trace of defensiveness left, only the composure of someone who had navigated a challenging but respectful exchange. The moderator wrapped the segment by thanking him again and turning to the camera with a brief preview of what was coming up next on the show. The studio audience applauded more fully this time, and the energy felt unified. It wasn't the applause of excitement or spectacle. It was appreciation for substance. As the cameras pulled back for the transition, viewers at home could see the hosts exchanging a few quiet words off-mic with Giamatti. Sunny appeared relaxed, smiling slightly as she adjusted her papers. There was no visible tension lingering between them. The seriousness of the discussion had not fractured the atmosphere. It had simply deepened it. When the episode aired in full later that day, and clips began circulating online, reactions reflected the tone of what had happened in the studio. Many viewers commented that the exchange felt mature and necessary. Some praised Sunny for asking direct questions about accountability and media impact. Others commended Giamatti for articulating a strong defense of artistic independence without dismissing broader concerns. On social media platforms, short excerpts of the phrase anticipatory self-censorship gained particular attention. Commentators debated what that concept means in the context of modern filmmaking. Some agreed with his caution against overcorrection, while others echoed Sunny's point that awareness does not equal restriction. The discussion extended beyond the show itself, moving into broader conversations about art, responsibility, and public influence. Importantly, the online discourse largely mirrored the tone of the original segment. It was serious, analytical, and measured rather than explosive. There were differing opinions, but few described the exchange as hostile. Instead, it was widely characterized as a thoughtful disagreement. In the hours following the broadcast, entertainment outlets summarized the moment as a substantive exchange, rather than a clash. Analysts noted that daytime talk shows often avoid extended philosophical debate, making this segment stand out for its depth. The fact that neither party raised their voice or resorted to personal criticism became part of the story itself. Some viewers wrote that they appreciated seeing two perspectives explored without interruption or oversimplification. Others said the conversation challenged their assumptions about how much responsibility actors should bear for cultural narratives. A few critics argued that the issue deserved even more time than the segment allowed. Behind the scenes, according to follow-up commentary from the show the next day, the producers were pleased that the discussion remained respectful. One of the co-hosts briefly mentioned during a later episode that the goal of the program is to encourage open dialogue, even when topics are complex. There was no attempt to sensationalize what had occurred. Sunny, in a short on-air clarification the following morning, reiterated that her questions were rooted in curiosity and concern rather than accusation. She emphasized that engaging with guests on meaningful topics is part of her role. Her tone was consistent with how she had conducted herself during the original segment. Giamatti, during a separate interview later in the week, referenced the appearance positively. He said he values conversations where different viewpoints are allowed space. He did not frame it as a confrontation. Instead, he described it as an example of healthy dialogue. Looking back at the full segment from beginning to end, what stands out most is not a dramatic turning point or a viral outburst. It is the gradual build of seriousness that unfolded naturally from a thoughtful question. The disagreement never left the bounds of professional respect. It never shifted into spectacle. Instead, it demonstrated how live television can handle complex issues with composure. The pacing mattered. The pauses mattered. The careful choice of words from both Sunny Hostin and Paul Giamatti mattered. Each moment built upon the last without spiraling. That is what made the exchange resonate. For viewers watching in real time, the experience likely felt different from typical daytime segments. There were fewer jokes, fewer light transitions. Instead, there was sustained focus. But the absence of drama did not diminish the impact. If anything, the restraint gave the conversation credibility. By the time the episode concluded and the credits rolled, the mood in the studio appeared steady and professional. The applause that followed the final segment of the show carried the same tone it had when Giamatti left the table, respectful and appreciative. Moments like this remind audiences that disagreement does not have to mean division. It can mean clarification. It can mean exploration. And in this case, it meant a serious but balanced conversation between a host drawing from legal experience and an actor defending the independence of his craft. The exchange did not produce a definitive answer about where artistic responsibility begins or ends. Instead, it modeled how that question can be explored publicly without hostility. And now we want to hear from you. Do you believe artists carry responsibility for how their work shapes public perception? Or do you agree that audiences and institutions share that burden more broadly? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.